The haunted house on Willow Lane. In the quiet suburbs of a small town, the Walters family moved into a large old house on Willow Lane. The house was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. It had been vacant for several years, and the neighbors whispered about strange occurrences in the past. The family of four, John, his wife Sarah, and their two young children, Lucy and Tom, were thrilled to start fresh in their new home. The house, built in the 1920s, had a grand staircase, antique furniture, and a long history. But from the moment they stepped inside, things began to feel off. At first it was small things. Lights flickered for no reason. The air in the house always felt damp, even in summer. But the more time they spent in the house, the more bizarre things began to happen. It started one night when Sarah was alone in the living room. She heard a faint sound, like whispering, coming from the corner of the room. She looked around, but there was no one there. She chalked it up to the wind or her imagination. But over the next few days, the whispers grew louder, always in that same corner. When she dared to look into the dark space, she saw a shadowy figure standing there, its face obscured, staring back at her. John, who was a skeptic, didn't believe her at first. He assumed Sarah was just tired or stressed from the move. But then one evening after a long day of work, he heard it too. The soft whispers, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. He turned to Sarah, but she was nowhere near him. "We need to leave this place," John finally said, his tone serious. But it was too late. The house had already begun to claim them. One evening, while John was working late, Sarah decided to explore the attic. She'd noticed a locked door there since they moved in, but never thought to open it. That night, with the house eerily quiet, she managed to break the lock and open the door. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. But as she stepped further inside, she saw something strange. In the corner of the attic was an old, decaying rocking chair, rocking gently on its own. As Sarah approached the chair, she noticed a journal tucked beneath it. The cover was brittle and yellowed with age. As she opened the journal, she was horrified to discover that it belonged to a woman named Abigail, who had lived in the house over a century ago. The journal chronicled Abigail's life, but there was one entry that made Sarah's blood run cold. "They are coming for me. I can hear them whispering in the dark. I will never leave this house." Terrified, Sarah rushed downstairs, but as she reached the bottom, she felt a chill run down her spine. The whispering had returned, now louder than ever, and it was coming from the walls themselves. She grabbed Lucy and Tom, telling them it was time to leave, but when she turned around, John was standing in the doorway, pale as a ghost. His eyes were wide with fear. "I saw her," John whispered. "I saw Abigail." He went on to explain that while working late, he had seen a figure in the hallway, a woman dressed in an old-fashioned gown. She had walked straight past him, her face pale and expressionless. He tried to follow her, but she vanished into thin air. As the days passed, the paranormal activity escalated. Furniture moved on its own, objects disappeared, and the children began to have night terrors. Lucy spoke of a woman who visited her at night, standing by her bed, staring down at her with hollow eyes. Tom refused to enter certain rooms, claiming the walls were watching him. The family, desperate for answers, contacted a local medium. The medium, upon entering the house, immediately went stiff with fear. "The spirits here are not at rest," she said. "There is a dark energy in this place, something that was never supposed to be disturbed." The medium led them to the basement, where they discovered an old ritual circle etched into the floor, surrounded by remnants of candles and strange symbols. According to the medium, the house had once been the site of occult practices, and Abigail, the woman in the journal, had been part of those rituals. It was said that she had died in the house under mysterious circumstances, her spirit trapped in the house by dark forces. After learning this, the family realized they had to leave before the spirits could claim them as well. But when they attempted to move out, they were met with one final warning. On the night they packed up their belongings, the house itself seemed to come alive. The front door slammed shut by itself, and the windows rattled violently. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the walls seemed to pulse with energy. With no other choice, the Walters family fled, never to return. The house on Willow Lane remained empty once again, its secrets buried in the dark corners of the attic, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to move in. Months passed after the Walters family fled the house on Willow Lane, and the town slowly moved on, but rumors about the haunted house never stopped. The old mansion stood empty, a dark silhouette against the sky, its windows broken and covered with ivy. The whispers, though, didn't fade. They only grew stronger in the town's lore. One winter evening, a new couple, the Harpers, moved into the house. They had heard the stories but dismissed them as mere superstition. After all, they had found the house at a great price, and they were eager to start a new chapter in their lives. Susan and Mark Harper, both in their late 30s, were looking for a fresh start. They had no idea what awaited them. The first few weeks were uneventful, and the Harpers quickly settled in. They were charmed by the house's vintage charm, its high ceilings, and the original hardwood floors. It seemed perfect, too perfect. It wasn't until they began remodeling the kitchen that things took a dark turn. One night, while working late on the renovations, Mark decided to take a break and grab a drink from the kitchen. As he passed by the stairwell, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above. Thinking it was just Susan, he called out to her, but no reply came. He shrugged it off as the house settling and continued with his work. Later, while watching TV in the living room, Mark again heard footsteps, this time pacing in the hallway outside. He stood up and cautiously walked to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway was empty. The air felt colder than it had before, and as Mark turned back to the living room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the large mirror above the fireplace, something was written in fog, as if a finger had traced the words there. The message read, "Get out." Mark's first thought was to blame it on condensation, but as he wiped the mirror, the words didn't disappear. They remained, as if they had been etched into the glass. Terrified, he turned to Susan and showed her the writing, but she didn't believe him. Over the next few days, things escalated further. Susan, who had always felt uneasy in the house, began hearing strange noises late at night, whispers, cries, and what sounded like children's laughter. One morning, she was walking down the stairs when she felt a cold, clammy hand briefly touch her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. Mark was becoming increasingly unsettled as well. One evening, while in the basement to grab some supplies, he discovered something horrifying. A hidden door behind a shelf. The door was old, its wood rotted, but there was something inside that called to him. He pried it open and found a small room filled with old, dust-covered relics, including a decaying doll, a box of strange, ritualistic items, and an old, brittle journal. It was then that Mark realized the house was no ordinary home. He flipped through the journal and discovered it belonged to none other than Abigail, the woman from the previous family's story. The journal contained cryptic notes about rituals, a spirit named the Watcher, and strange symbols that matched the ones found in the basement circle. But the last entry made Mark's blood freeze. They will come for me, just as they came for the others. The Watcher demands it. I have no choice. He watches always, and soon they will come to take my soul. Mark was now certain that the house was cursed, that it was more than just a haunting, it was a trap. He shared his findings with Susan, but she refused to leave. She had grown attached to the house, convinced that they could fix whatever was wrong with it. But things only got worse. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Mark and Susan were sitting in the living room when they both heard the unmistakable sound of children's voices from the attic. The voices were soft at first, then growing louder, as though they were calling to them. The couple ascended the stairs, trembling. The door to the attic was ajar, and as they stepped inside, they were met with an oppressive silence. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Mark tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the air around them grew cold, and the whispers returned, this time clear and deliberate. You should not have come. Mark and Susan tried to break open the door, but before they could, the temperature plummeted to near freezing. They felt a presence behind them, something cold and unnatural. Turning around, they saw it. A tall, shadowy figure in the corner of the attic, its face hidden in darkness. The figure didn't move at first, but when it did, it was with a slow, deliberate pace. Its eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, and it spoke in a voice that was a distorted mix of whispers and growls. I have waited for you. Now you are mine. The couple was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. Mark tried to grab Susan's hand, but she had already collapsed, her eyes wide with terror. The figure advanced, and just as it reached them, everything went black. When the local police found the house the next day, Mark and Susan were gone. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of them anywhere. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Neighbors later reported seeing strange lights flickering in the windows of the house, and some even claimed they heard the sounds of children laughing, soft and eerie, floating through the night air. The house on Willow Lane remained abandoned once more, its dark secrets once again hidden behind its crumbling walls. As the years passed, the house on Willow Lane remained abandoned. No one dared to live there for long, and rumors spread throughout the town about the terrifying fate of those who had moved in. The Harpers were never found, and the local authorities could not explain their sudden disappearance. But as the house decayed further, it became a symbol of dread, something that couldn't be ignored, something that haunted the very air around it. Then, in the winter of the following year, a group of urban explorers decided to visit the notorious house. Among them was a young woman named Emily, who had heard the stories of Willow Lane since she was a child. She had always been fascinated by the supernatural and decided to investigate the house for herself, documenting everything with her camera. Emily was joined by 3 friends: Mike, a seasoned explorer; Rachel, an amateur photographer; and Alex, who had a keen interest in paranormal investigations. They had heard all the rumors, but they didn't believe in ghosts. They believed in the thrill of the unknown and the idea of uncovering something no one had ever seen before. But as they approached the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The group entered through a broken window on the ground floor. Inside, the house was even more decayed than they had imagined. Cracked walls, peeling wallpaper, and a smell of mildew in the air. But what caught their attention was the overwhelming silence. There was no sound, no movement, just the heavy, oppressive stillness of the house. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting. They set up their cameras and began to explore the first floor. Emily's camera captured every moment, but when they looked at the footage later, they found something strange. In one of the frames, there was a shadow standing just behind them, though no one was there in reality. The shadow seemed to move in ways that didn't align with their own movements, as if it was separate from them, its own entity. As they ventured deeper into the house, they noticed a strange pattern. Each room they entered felt colder than the last. A chilling wind would sweep through the halls, even though the windows were sealed shut. And the whispers, those familiar whispers, began again, this time faint but unmistakable. The group gathered in the living room reviewing their findings. Rachel suggested they use a spirit box, a device that scans radio frequencies to allow spirits to communicate. Reluctantly, they set it up and waited. At first, there was only static, the usual crackling sound, but then the device began to pick up something, a voice. It was faint, but it was clear enough to understand. Leave, now, before. The group froze, their hearts racing. Mike, ever the skeptic, tried to brush it off. It's just interference, nothing more. But Emily, her hands shaking, stared at the device. The voice continued, "You cannot leave. The Watcher sees you." A chill swept through the room and the temperature dropped sharply. Suddenly, the door to the attic slammed shut with a deafening bang, making the entire house shake. The group jumped to their feet, but before they could react, the whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once. Then, the air became thick with the scent of rotting flesh. The smell was overpowering, nauseating. Emily's stomach turned, and she stumbled back. But as she did, she saw it, a dark figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, its form almost indistinguishable from the shadows around it, but its eyes, they glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. The Watcher, the entity that had trapped everyone who had ever lived in the house. The Watcher moved slowly toward them, its presence suffocating, as though it was pulling the very air from their lungs. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the walls seemed to close in on them. Emily reached for her camera, desperate to document this moment, but as her hand touched the lens, it cracked, and the screen went black. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the Watcher stopped. Its glowing eyes bored into Emily's soul, as if it was reading her every thought. The whispers stopped, and there was a long, painful silence. "You will join us," the voice said, not through the spirit box, but directly in their minds. Emily screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the house itself, the walls trembling as if in agony. The group tried to run, but they were paralyzed, rooted to the floor. The Watcher reached out, its long, skeletal hand hovering inches from Emily's face. In that moment, Emily understood the true horror of the house. The Watcher wasn't just a spirit. It was the manifestation of the house itself, feeding off the souls of anyone who dared enter. It was the keeper of the house, a twisted ancient entity that had trapped the souls of those who had come before. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Emily broke free from the paralysis. She grabbed Rachel's arm and ran, pushing through the thick, suffocating air. But as they neared the front door, it slammed shut with such force that the entire house shook. They were trapped. The last thing Emily saw before the darkness consumed them was the Watcher's face, its hollow eyes and crooked grin, watching them with cruel anticipation. When the police arrived days later, responding to a call from the local town, they found nothing but the remnants of the explorers' equipment, broken cameras, scattered notebooks, and a single, half-burned flashlight. There was no sign of Emily, Mike, Rachel, or Alex. The house on Willow Lane had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before. The town never spoke of the house again. It was as though it had never existed. The building stood empty, waiting for the next group of curious souls to stumble upon its threshold, and deep within its walls, the Watcher waited, patient, hungry, and ready for the next victim. After the disappearance of the explorers, the town of Willow Creek began to change. While the locals still whispered about the house on Willow Lane, they did so in hushed tones, as though speaking of it out loud could somehow invite its horrors into their lives. Most people avoided the area, and the few who lived near the house reported strange occurrences, objects moving in the night, distant sounds of crying, and an unnerving feeling of being watched. But the most chilling part was that over time, more and more people began to have nightmares. People who had never stepped foot near the house found themselves waking in cold sweats, unable to shake the vivid dreams of the Watcher. Some even claimed to see its eyes glowing in the dark corners of their bedrooms as they slept. The house, it seemed, had reached beyond its crumbling walls, its malevolent influence seeping into the town itself. The town of Willow Creek was slowly becoming a place of fear, where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of what had happened on Willow Lane. But the most disturbing discovery came when an old man, Robert Taylor, moved into the town. Robert was an eccentric, a historian who had spent most of his life studying the supernatural. He had heard about the house, and being drawn to its mystery, he decided to investigate. He believed there was more to the story of the house than the rumors suggested. Robert was the first person brave enough to walk into the house after the explorers had vanished. He was well aware of the dangers that the house posed, but he had a different mission. He believed that the key to stopping the haunting lay in uncovering the house's hidden history, the origin of the Watcher, and why it had claimed so many lives. With a flashlight and a journal in hand, Robert made his way through the decaying front door. As he stepped inside, the familiar chill gripped him. The air was stale, as though it had not been disturbed for years. The silence was oppressive, thick, and suffocating. He walked cautiously, making his way to the attic where the Watcher had been seen by the explorers. The house seemed to breathe around him, and with every step, the temperature dropped even further. As he reached the attic door, it creaked open on its own, the shadows within growing darker, deeper. Inside, Robert found something that made his blood run cold, a series of old paintings, each depicting a different face. They were all portraits of people who had lived in the house throughout its history, families that had come and gone. But as Robert studied them more closely, something unsettling became clear. Each person in the paintings had eyes that were eerily vacant, and their faces twisted into expressions of horror. In the center of the room, Robert discovered an old journal, much like the one the Harpers had found. This one, however, was different. It was bound in dark leather, and as Robert flipped through its pages, he realized it was written by the original owner of the house, Abigail, the first victim of the Watcher. The journal described a ritual, one that had been performed by Abigail's family in an attempt to summon a spirit. They had believed they could communicate with the dead, but they had unintentionally opened a gateway to something far darker. The spirit they had summoned was not a benevolent ghost. It was the Watcher, an ancient entity that had been trapped between worlds, waiting for a way to cross into the living realm. As Robert read further, the journal revealed the horrifying truth. The Watcher was not just a spirit, but a creature that fed on fear. It could only manifest when it was invited, either through rituals or through the lingering souls of those who died in the house. And once it took hold, it could never be stopped. The entity had bound itself to the house, using the fear of its inhabitants to grow stronger. But what Robert uncovered next was even worse. The Watcher, it seemed, was not bound to just the house. It was bound to the very land itself. The house was built on a cursed plot of land, and every time a new family moved in, the Watcher grew more powerful. Abigail and her family had tried to escape, but they were never able to leave. The house had kept them trapped, their spirits now part of the haunting, feeding the Watcher's hunger. Robert felt his pulse quicken as he read the final entry in the journal. "There is no escape. The Watcher has claimed me. It will claim them all. The house will never let us go." Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind him, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable degree. Robert's breath came in sharp gasps as he turned to face the darkness. The glowing eyes of the Watcher pierced through the shadows, and a cold, oppressive presence filled the room. "You are too late," the Watcher's voice echoed, filling Robert's mind. "You cannot stop what has already begun. This place is mine, and soon you will be too." Robert tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though the house itself was holding him back. The walls seemed to close in around him, the very foundation of the house groaning as though it was alive, feeding on his fear. His heart pounded in his chest as the Watcher advanced, its dark figure taking shape in the center of the room. In his final moments, Robert realized the horrible truth. The Watcher wasn't just an entity, it was the house itself, an ancient force that had been born from the land, fed by the souls of the lost. And once it had enough, it would spread beyond Willow Lane, claiming anyone who dared to come near. The next morning, Robert's car was found parked outside the house, but he was never seen again. His disappearance only added to the ever-growing legend of Willow Lane. No one dared enter the house again after that. The town was slowly drained of its life, the air heavy with the unspoken fear that one day the Watcher would escape. The house on Willow Lane stood silent, its dark legacy growing stronger with each passing day. And in the deep oppressive darkness of the house, the Watcher waited.